In the winter of 1878, in the Wind River Range of the Wyoming Territory, every trapper and trader said Silas Croft was wasting precious firewood on a foolish wooden contraption. He was tinkering inside his cabin, using daylight he should have been spending on his traplines. By the time the spring thaw finally broke the high country's grip, many of those men had retreated to the fort at Lander, their feet wrapped in rags, nursing blackened toes. They realized too late that Silas's foolishness was the only reason he still had all 10 of his. The cold that year was not a simple thing. It was a presence, a physical weight that settled into the valley before Thanksgiving and did not lift until April. Silas Croft, a man in his 40s whose face was a map of wind and sun, understood this cold intimately. He lived by its rules. His cabin was dug into a south-facing slope, buffered by earth and granite. But the enemy was not the air outside the cabin. The enemy was the moisture inside. It was a war fought every single night, and the battleground was his pair of heavy, oil-tanned leather boots. They were his most critical tool, more important than his rifle, more valuable than his knife. A man with a broken rifle could still set snares. A man with useless feet was already dead. The cycle was relentless. He would spend 10 hours wading through hip-deep drifts, the snow packing against the leather, the seepage from melting ice slow and inevitable. He would return to his cabin at dusk, his feet numb, the boots stiffening into iron prisons as the temperature dropped with the sun. He would pry them off, his wool socks steaming in the frigid air. And then the nightly ritual would begin. He would place the boots on the hearthstone near the small pot-bellied stove that was his only source of life. This was the dilemma. If he placed them too far away, the leather would remain damp, the inner lining holding a treacherous film of moisture. By morning they would be frozen solid, impossible to put on without risking a crippling frostbite just to force his feet inside. But if he placed them too close, the intense dry heat would cook the leather. He could smell it, a sharp, acrid scent of scorching hide and melting tallow. The heat would shrink the boot, cracking the seams, turning the supple, oiled leather into brittle, warped armor. The stitches, made of waxed linen, would grow brittle and snap. He had already lost one pair this way, the sole peeling away from the upper, a catastrophic failure that had cost him a week's worth of pelts and nearly his left foot. That night, the wind found a new way to shriek, pulling at the sod roof. Silas sat on his stool, rubbing his stockinged feet, the skin white and waxy. He stared at his boots, propped on the stones. They were a compromise, set just far enough away to avoid burning, but close enough that the toes were still rigid with ice. He knew with a sinking certainty that they would not be truly dry by morning. He was slowly destroying the only things that allowed him to walk. This standard method, the way every man he knew dried his gear, was not just inefficient. It was a trap. It was forcing a choice between frostbite tomorrow and structural failure next week. Something was fundamentally wrong. Silas Croft had built his cabin the standard way, just as he had been taught by the older trappers who had come west before the war. It was a simple, brutal architecture, born of necessity and speed. The walls were lodgepole pine, hastily felled and saddle-notched, the gaps chinked with a frozen slurry of mud and dried grass. This chinking was the first point of failure. It was never truly airtight. As the green logs settled and twisted, the mud would crack and fall out, opening dozens of small mouths that drank the wind. The cold didn't just seep in, it streamed. On the worst nights, Silas could watch the flame of his candle bend sideways, licking horizontally toward the stove, pulled by the draught. His floor was packed earth, and this was the second, more insidious problem. The ground beneath the floorboards he tried to lay was permafrost. The heat from his stove warmed the top layer of dirt, which drew up the deep, subterranean moisture. His floor, especially near the walls, was perpetually damp. It was a cold sink, a zone of humidity that turned the bottom 6 inches of his cabin into a refrigeration unit. This was where his boots sat. He had tried everything. He'd built a small rock wall around the hearth to try and trap the heat, but it just created a pocket of scorching air that threatened to set the cabin ablaze. While the rest of the room remained frigid, he'd tried stuffing the boots with hot pebbles from the fire, but they were either too hot and seared the wool lining, or they cooled in minutes, becoming cold, damp stones locked deep in the toe. He tried stuffing them with dry grass, but the grass just absorbed the moisture and held it, turning into a sodden, frozen plug by morning. He'd even tried hanging them from a peg, but they hung mouth down, trapping the moisture inside, preventing any warm air from entering. The frustration was a cold knot in his stomach. He was doing everything right according to the wisdom of the mountains, and it was still failing him. He was burning through his precious, hard-won stack of cured pine, feeding the stove day and night, only to have the heat torn from him by the wind and swallowed by the floor. He sat one evening, his journal open on his knee, trying to calculate how much firewood he had left. It wasn't enough to last until the thaw if this cold snap held. He was burning fuel, not just for warmth, but in a futile, losing battle against damp. His boots, sitting near the stove, were a perfect metaphor for his situation. The side facing the fire was hot to the touch, the leather tight and dry. The side facing the wall was covered in a fine layer of frost. He was trapped in a cycle of half measures, and the mountains did not reward half measures. He looked at the splitting seam on his left boot, a small crack near the toe where the stitching had pulled free. He thought of the weeks of work it had taken to trade for these boots, the finest made in St. Louis. Now, the high country was unmaking them, night by night. He realized that the problem wasn't his execution. The problem was the principle itself. He wasn't failing. The standard way was failing. The insight did not come from another man. It came from the fire. Silas was a watcher, a man who had survived by noticing the small, silent movements of the world. He tracked animals by the faintest disturbance. He read the weather in the color of the sky at dusk. Now he applied that same focus to the air inside his cabin. He lit his pipe, the tobacco a rare comfort, and watched the smoke. It did not drift aimlessly. It rose from the bowl, climbed in a steady, thin column toward the ceiling, and then spread out, forming a hazy layer just below the roof beams. He stood on his stool and reached up. The air near the ceiling was shockingly warm, almost hot. Down by his feet, the draft from the doorsill was a knife edge of ice. The heat from his stove did not fill the room evenly. It rose, gathered at the highest point, and then, as it cooled, or was forced out by the cracks in the roof, it fell along the cold outer walls. He took a piece of his kindling, a long, thin sliver of pine, and lit the end, then blew it out, creating a small, persistent trail of smoke. He used it like a probe. Near the floor, the smoke was sluggish, pulled toward the door. Near the stove, it was whipped upward in the convection current. He held the stick near his boots. The smoke barely moved. It pooled around the boot openings, the air cold and stagnant. He then hung one of his heavy wool mittens on a hook, high on the wall, far above the stove. It was soaked from setting a beaver trap in overflow. He left it there. In an hour it was bone dry. He felt a jolt of understanding. He wasn't fighting the cold. He was fighting stagnant, wet air. The boots, sitting on the floor, were in the coldest, dampest part of the cabin. The heat from the stove was radiating outward, cooking the side of the leather facing it, but it was doing nothing to dry the inside. The boot, sitting upright, was a vessel. It was trapping the cold, moist air. What he needed was not more heat. He needed air movement. He needed to get the boots up into the warm air, and he needed to get that warm air inside the boot. He looked at his pipe smoke again, curling toward the ceiling. The problem was physics, and the solution would be too. He suddenly remembered watching his grandmother in Vermont years ago, drying apples. She hadn't laid them on the hearth. She had strung them on a string high above the fireplace, where the air was always moving. He needed a way to hold his boots upside down, to let the heavy, damp air fall out, while the hot, dry air rose in. He would not check his lines the next day. The decision was immediate and final. A day's lost pelts was a small price to pay for a solution that could save his season and his life. He spent the morning not with his rifle, but with his hatchet and his auger. He needed a base, something heavy that wouldn't tip over when loaded with his waterlogged heavy boots. He found a thick, flat cross-section of a cured cottonwood log he'd been saving for a table. It was perfect, 2 feet wide, 4 inches thick and heavy as granite. He set it on the floor. Next, he needed the posts. He went out into the snow, the wind biting at his face, and searched for the right wood. He didn't want pine. It was too resinous and would get sticky with the heat. He found a stand of young aspen. The wood was clear-grained, smooth and strong. He cut 4 sections, each about 2 feet long and 3 inches in diameter. He brought them back inside, the white wood a stark contrast to the dark, smoky logs of his cabin. The planning was methodical. He sat on the floor, the wood laid out around him, his boots next to him for measurement. He used his knife to take the calipers of the boot opening. The posts had to be thick enough to be strong, but thin enough to allow a wide gap for air to circulate around them and into the boot. This was the critical insight. The post wasn't just to hold the boot, it was to open it, to create a channel for convection. He drilled 4 holes in the cottonwood base using his hand auger. The work was slow, his hands cramping. He angled the holes slightly so the posts would splay outward. This would give each boot more room, keeping them from touching. Then he began to whittle the aspen posts. This was not rough work. It was a craft. He tapered each post, making it thinner at the top. He rounded the tips, smoothing them with his whetstone until they were polished, knowing that any sharp edge would catch and tear the wool lining of his boots. He was building a tool, and like any good tool, it had to be precise. He whittled away, the pile of white shavings growing around his feet. He made 2 posts taller for his boots and 2 shorter, thinner posts for his heavy mittens. He didn't just want to dry his boots, he wanted to solve the entire problem of damp. When the posts were finished, he hammered them into the holes in the base. It was a tight fit, the green wood swelling slightly in the warmth of the cabin. The contraption stood on the floor, looking like some strange, pale tree. It was simple, functional, and utterly unique. He picked it up. It was heavy, stable. He placed it not on the hearth, but beside it, about 3 feet from the pot-bellied stove. It was in the Goldilocks zone, out of the scorching direct radiation, but squarely in the path of the rising column of hot air. He stood back, looking at his creation, then at his boots. He was ready for the test. The work to build his boot tree took 2 full days. He fell behind on his lines, and he knew he would pay for it in lost fur. But as he worked, shaping the wood, he felt a focus, a quiet confidence that he hadn't felt in months. He was not passively surviving the winter, he was actively engaging it, building a defense based on an observed principle. He was turning his cabin from a cold sieve into a functioning system. The aspen posts were whittled to a smooth finish, the base was level. He had even used the remaining wood to carve a small shelf onto the side, a place to put his tin of boot grease. The grease, he reasoned, should be applied when the leather was warm and dry, its pores open. This way, the tallow and pine pitch would soak in, feeding the hide rather than just freezing on the surface. His entire boot care process would be revolutionized by this one simple piece of furniture. That evening, he returned from a short, brutal check of his closest traps. The temperature had dropped again, and a low grey ceiling of cloud promised more snow. He was soaked, his feet numb. This was not a drill, it was the real trial. He entered the cabin, stamping the snow from his boots. He unlaced them, his fingers stiff. He pulled them off. They were heavy, saturated, the leather dark with water. He built up the fire in the stove until the iron sides glowed a dull cherry in the dim light. The cabin began to fight back against the encroaching cold. Then he took the boots. He turned them upside down and slid them onto the 2 tall aspen posts. They seated perfectly, the rounded tips of the posts pressing deep into the toe, holding the boot open. The boot shaft, now inverted, created a wide, open chimney. He did the same with his mittens on the smaller posts. He placed the entire contraption in its designated spot beside the stove. He made his dinner, a thin stew of jerky and dried beans. He ate listening to the wind. He could see the physics at work. The air, superheated by the stove, rose. It struck the cottonwood base and was funneled upward, flowing into the open mouths of his boots. This column of warm, dry air traveled the length of the boot, absorbing the moisture from the wool and the leather. As this air became saturated and cooled slightly, it grew heavier. It then fell out of the boot, displaced by the new, hotter, drier air rising from below. He had created a passive thermal siphon, a perfect, continuous engine of air powered only by the waste heat of his fire. He slept, but it was a light, fitful sleep, the sleep of a man waiting for a verdict. He woke in the middle of the night to feed the stove. The cabin was cold. The fire burned down to glowing embers. This was the moment of truth. In the old days, his boots would have been stiff with frost. The dampness inside them turned to ice. He reached out in the dark and touched the leather. It was not cold. It was not frozen. It felt neutral. He built the fire back up, and before crawling back into his bedroll, he felt inside the boot. The wool lining was not fluffy, but it was not wet. It was merely damp, and it was warm. He slept again, this time deeply. When he woke at dawn, the cabin was filled with a grey, snowy light. He swung his legs off his cot and, out of habit, braced himself for the painful ritual of forcing his feet into frozen boots. He reached for them. They were light. He slid his foot into the right boot. It slid in effortlessly. The inside was not just dry, it was warm. The wool lining was fluffy, the leather supple and flexible. He stood up and stamped his foot. It was like putting on a new pair of boots. He checked his mittens, bone dry. He felt a profound sensory of relief, so deep it was almost comical. He had won. He had used his mind and 2 days of work to defeat the single most debilitating part of his winter. That day, a blizzard descended, a true blue norther that trapped him in his cabin for 3 solid days. The wind howled and snow buried his cabin up to the eaves. He kept the fire roaring, and every night his boots and mittens, soaked from his trips to cut more wood or check the snares near the cabin, would be placed on the tree. Every morning they were perfectly, comfortably dry. The leather, no longer cooked and frozen, held its shape and its waterproofing. The stitching, no longer stressed, remained tight. He had not just made his boots dry faster, he had saved their lives, and in doing so, he had likely saved his own. When the spring rendezvous came and the trappers gathered at the trading post to sell their pelts and replenish supplies, the talk inevitably turned to the winter. It had been a brutal one. Men were missing, presumed dead. Others, like a young trapper from Ohio named Elias Thorne, sat by the post's main fire, his feet wrapped in bandages. The cold, it just got in, Thorne muttered, his face pale. My boots, they split at the welt, never could get 'em dry. Time I got back to the fort, the doc had to take 2 tows. The other men nodded grimly. They all had similar stories. Boots that cooked by the fire, boots that froze solid. Silas Croft, standing in the back, said nothing. He just unpacked his gear. Another trapper, a veteran named Bo Russell, noticed Silas's boots. They were the same pair he'd seen him with last fall, but they looked almost new. The leather was dark and supple, the stitching intact. Hell, Croft, Bo said. You buy new boots? Nope, Silas replied, pulling his strange 4-posted wooden contraption from his pack. Just built a better way to dry 'em. The men gathered around. It was odd-looking, functional, and clearly handmade. Silas explained it not with pride, but with the simple clarity of a man stating a fact. You're putting 'em on the cold floor, he said. That's the problem. And you're cooking them with the fire. The heat's got to rise and the water's got to fall out. You're trying to dry 'em like a rock, but a boot's a vessel. You got to dry it from the inside, with air. There was a long silence. The men looked at the device, then at Elias Thorne's bandaged feet, then back. The logic was inescapable. It was simple. It was obvious, now that one man had done it. That spring, not a single trapper left the post without having built or bought his own version. The post's blacksmith, a practical German, saw the utility immediately. He began fabricating them out of wrought iron, with the central post and rods splaying out. He called them boot butlers. Settler families heading west on the Oregon Trail saw them at the trading posts and copied the design. In the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest, in the ranches of the High Plains, and in the mining camps of the Rockies, the boot tree became a standard piece of equipment. It sat by the stove in every sod house, cabin, and bunkhouse, a silent, essential tool. Its origin, connected to Silas Croft, was forgotten in a generation. It simply became part of the vernacular wisdom of the frontier, a piece of technology so perfectly suited to its environment that it seemed as if it had always existed. The genius of Silas Croft's invention was not in its complexity, but in its profound understanding of thermodynamics. He had, with no formal training, perfectly harnessed the principles of convection. The standard method of placing boots on a hearth relied on conduction, heat transfer from the hot stone, and radiation from the fire itself. Both were inefficient and destructive. Conduction was uneven, and intense radiation destroyed the leather's protein structure, making it brittle. Silas's boot tree, by contrast, was a passive convective engine. By elevating the boots, he moved them out of the cabin's cold sink on the floor and into the thermal column of rising hot air from the stove. By inverting them on posts, he created a differential. The warm, dry air from the room, being less dense, flowed up into the boot, filling the toe. As this air picked up moisture from the lining, it became cooler and denser. This heavier, moist air would then fall out of the boot's opening, displaced by the continuous stream of fresh, warm air rising from below. He had created a perfect, self-regulating chimney. Modern electric boot dryers, found in ski lodges and homes today, use the exact same principle. They use a small fan or a gentle heating element to force warm air up through vertical tubes. Silas Croft had built a passive, non-electric version over a century earlier, powered only by the ambient waste heat of his wood stove. It was a masterpiece of appropriate technology. It didn't fight the environment. It used the environment's own laws to solve a problem. It recognized that the enemy was not cold, but humidity. It solved the problem not with more power, but with smarter design. The design didn't just dry the leather, it preserved it, extending its life, and by extension, the life of the man who wore it. Silas Croft trapped the Wind River Range for 7 more winters. He was never again threatened by frostbite, and the pair of boots he'd saved with his invention lasted him another 5 years, an almost unheard-of lifespan in that unforgiving country. He died, not in the mountains, but years later, on a small ranch in the Oregon Valley, a quiet older man known for his meticulous care of his tools. He never patented his idea. He never sought credit for it. The invention simply spread, becoming part of the landscape, a common-sense solution adopted by thousands. The legacy of the boot tree was not in its fame, but in its function. It was in the thousands of toes saved from the surgeon's knife, the tens of thousands of workdays not lost to misery, the millions of mornings where a family could put on warm, dry boots before facing the cold. It was a quiet, anonymous victory. The story of Silas Croft and his boot tree is a lesson in the power of observation. It is a reminder that survival is not always about brute strength, but about the willingness to question the standard way. He saw what everyone else saw, a cold room and a hot fire, but he perceived the invisible forces at play, the movement of air, the behavior of moisture, the tyranny of a damp floor. True innovation is often not the creation of something new, but the reorganization of what is already there. It is the wisdom to see that the problem is not always the cold, but the damp. It is the insight to understand that the most powerful solutions are often not about opposing nature, but about aligning with its fundamental laws. The difference between comfort and catastrophe, between survival and disaster, can often be found in a simple piece of wood placed in exactly the right spot.